In this program, we will trace the origins of our national literature and the contributions made by Native Americans, explorers, early colonists, and political leaders. We will see how slavery was a flashpoint for writers who began to question whether an enlightened people could live up to the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And we will learn about writers who began to create a distinctly American literature, many of whom reflected on America's pristine wilderness, which was about to be forever altered. Stories, poetry, and song were part of America's heritage long before Europeans ever set foot on the land. Native American lore was not written, however. It was spoken and sung. As entire Indian nations were virtually wiped out by European disease and conflict, a vast treasury of stories and verse was lost forever. A surviving passage from the Cherokee version of the creation says,
"The earth is a great island floating in a sea of water, suspended at each of the 4 cardinal points by a cord hanging down from the sky vault. When the world grows old, the people will die and the cords will break and let the earth sink down into the ocean, and all will be water again."
So if we mean by literature things that people listen to, if we mean stories and legends, myths and songs, then there definitely was a literature. And there were more than 300 different languages that the Native Americans, different tribes were using. So there was a very rich literature.
The first European explorers who arrived in America brought with them a different tradition, that of the written word. They described their discoveries in journals and accounts written to impress monarchs or wealthy patrons who had financed their travels. Expeditions from Portugal, Spain, France, and England set out for America. The chronicles of these early explorers were the first written works of the New World.
Everything they saw and experienced, they wrote down because they were great recorders of what happened to them. There are many histories and many journals that they kept. But most of them are not introspective. They're more reports of what happened.
One of the interesting things about America at its inception was the sense that people had, that men had, of being in a new world, that the geography was new and different. There was a boundlessness to the American physical space that was totally unlike the world that had been left behind in Europe.
In 1564, France challenged the Spanish claim to the American Southeast. While the French and Spanish battled, English settlers came to North America, and English became the dominant language of the new land. In 1607, the first successful English colony in North America was established at Jamestown, Virginia. Here, Captain John Smith made a significant contribution to American literature by writing to attract the general public. In his General History of Virginia, Smith described his capture by Indians and his dramatic rescue by Pocahontas, the chief's daughter. Religious persecution caused thousands of Puritans to immigrate to the New World. However, they were not advocates of religious freedom. They wanted to build a community according to their own moral principles. Harvard College was founded in 1636, after the Massachusetts Bay Colony was settled. 3 years later, the colony imported a printing press from England. Literacy was a prime concern in the community, so members could read the Bible and learn to protect themselves from sin and temptation.
Maybe the greatest literary form during the 17th century was the sermon. We don't think that sermons were fun to be sitting through, but the Puritans sat through sermons for a couple of hours, every Sunday at least, and on special occasions, even longer ones. and sermon giving was a really like a performance for them. The ministers would be talking about doctrine, but they would talk about doctrine in very vivid terms, and the more vivid, the better.
The Bay Psalm Book was the first English-language volume published in America. Richard Mather, a leading Puritan clergyman, presided over this literary event.
All the books of the Scripture should by God's ordinance be written in the mother tongue of each nation. Hence the Psalms are translated into English, that we may sing the Lord's songs.
All literature was supposed to offer a religious message, and Michael Wigglesworth's The Day of Doom was the most popular because it dealt with death and eternal punishment. Roger Williams, a prominent but rebellious religious leader, argued that government and religion must be separate. As a result, he was banished from Massachusetts. He established Providence, Rhode Island, and continued to argue for the separation of church and state, a concept that became the cornerstone of the nation. Cotton Mather, Richard Mather's grandson, became an influential minister and author. Mather was intensely religious and a prolific writer, and witchcraft was one of his subjects. A group of girls living near Salem, inspired by Mather's writing, instigated what is now known as the Salem witch trials of 1692. 19 people were tried and hanged as witches, and public outrage over the trials and executions led to the decline of Puritan influence.
Among the Puritans in Massachusetts, there were at least 2 women who attained significant readership. There was the poet Anne Bradstreet, who began to publish her poems in the late 17th century, and hers were perhaps the first poems published by a woman in the New World, at least by a woman in English, writing in English in the New World.
I am obnoxious to each carping tongue, who says my hand a needle better fits. For such despite they cast on female wits. If what I do prove well, it won't advance. They'll say it's stolen, or else it was by chance.
You also have Mary Rowlandson, who in the late 17th century writes about her captivity. She was captured by an Indian tribe and wrote about this as an example of a kind of spiritual experience.
Enslaved Africans had been brought to the New World ever since the first colonies were established. Once in America, their birth languages were denied to them, and laws were passed prohibiting them from learning to read and write. Despite these hardships, some of those in bondage managed to find their voice.
Olaudah Equiano, or Gustav Vasa, as he was also called, was an African who was born in Benin and was enslaved in his home country. He wrote about his adventures, and his narrative was the model for many of the slave narratives that were then published in the U.S. in the 19th century. He wrote in his narrative, "Amongst the poor chained men, I found some of my own nation. I was then a little revived. But still I feared I should be put to death. The white people looked and acted in so savage a manner." From his perspective, it was the Europeans who were savage. It was the Europeans who looked as though they were the other. And certainly based on their actions, it was the Europeans who were the barbarians.
Another slave, Phyllis Wheatley, like Vasa, was taught to read and write and became a poet.
I, young in life by seeming cruel fate, was snatched from Afrique's fancied happy seat. What pangs excruciating must molest, what sorrows labor in my parents' breast.
As the 18th century began, American colonies were bustling. Public reading habits changed as newspapers and magazines began to flourish. People still read the Bible, but they also read books on travel, politics, and history. Some changes were felt quickly with the outbreak of revolution in 1775. However, it would be many generations before Americans examined themselves as individuals and began to reflect this in their literature. Before the Revolution, British influence dominated American politics, commerce, and literature. In the struggle for freedom, the people of the colonies asserted their independence in actions and in words, and a distinctly American literature began to emerge. Ideas from the Enlightenment, a philosophical movement in Europe, began to drift to the New World. Colonists began to explore the notion that human beings have the natural desire and right to perfect themselves.
During this time, the sense that the individual soul could have a power, that the individual was important, came out. And some people have argued that this led to the sense that a political will could also develop out of the individual.
James Otis is credited with being the first to crystallize the idea of independence in the minds of the colonists. In 1762, he wrote a pamphlet that questioned for the first time taxation without representation. Songs and ballads that expressed the revolutionary spirit were sung in homes, by campfires, and in churches. Writer Thomas Paine of Pennsylvania sounded the most potent rallying cry of all in his pamphlet Common Sense, published in early 1776. Paine dismissed the idea that England had a right to govern the colonies.
Small islands not capable of protecting themselves are the proper objects for kingdoms to take under their care. But there is something very absurd in a continent governed by an island.
In Philadelphia, the First Continental Congress was torn by stormy debates for and against independence. John Adams won great respect for his thoughtful arguments favoring independence, published in pamphlets and in newspapers. Abigail Adams, John's wife, also wrote effectively on political subjects, stretching the limits society imposed on women. She was most eloquent when she saw injustice.
Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. The ladies will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice.
In June of 1776, Thomas Jefferson was delegated by the Continental Congress to draft a Declaration of Independence. In the document of July 4, 1776, colonial Americans spoke with one voice.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
The Declaration of Independence stands as a classic of American and indeed of world literature.
What's unusual, and there was a seed of conflict to come embedded here, is that these ideals that were enshrined in the Declaration of Independence applied to men, white men, and insofar as the ability and right to vote to white men who owned property. So this wonderful sense of possibility and boundless sense of freedom, but it's not freedom that is really available to everyone.
The war dragged on, and patriotic enthusiasm began to waver. Troops grew mutinous. Soldiers deserted. Once again, Thomas Paine took up his pen, this time to inspire the men in the field.
These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman.
Benjamin Franklin was the universally respected leader of the Revolution. He wrote Poor Richard's Almanac.
Franklin was a great writer, a great satirist, a great humorist. He was a master of many forms, and his almanac contained wonderfully pithy formulations of how people should live their lives. And these came to replace, for many people, the power of religion.
Franklin's Poor Richard gave Americans guidelines for living in their new society and a self-image that they readily adopted, that of an industrious, sensible, self-reliant, sociable, and good-humored people. Franklin also participated in drafting the Constitution, considered one of the greatest political documents of the world.
The whole revolution was based upon this notion that there were natural rights that could be invoked to prove the need for independence. And Franklin, who was a moral philosopher as well as a political philosopher, formulated this very well when he said, "God grant that not only the love of liberty, but a thorough knowledge of the rights of man may pervade all the nations of the earth, so that a philosopher may set his foot anywhere on its surface and say, 'This is my country.'"
With a new government and a new president, America in 1789 entered a period of peace and prosperity.
After the Revolution, there was an even greater sense of self-consciousness on the part of Americans. And American writers began to develop this struggle for a national voice, a national literature that would reflect the new conditions of a new country.
In 1787, the first dramatic comedy was written and produced in the United States and opened in a small New York theater. In his play The Contrast, Royal Tyler sounded a nationalistic note when he asked the audience,
"Why should our thoughts to distant countries roam, when each refinement may be found at home?"
In 1789, Noah Webster published Dissertations on the English Language, in which he showed that popular usage was changing and that a distinctly American language was necessary and unavoidable. American writers at the time were beginning to turn out novels simply to compete with the most popular British imports. Sentimental novels, which generally dealt with seduction, most often of an innocent young girl by a heartless young man, were in great demand, as were Gothic and satirical novels. William Hill Brown's The Power of Sympathy, published in 1789 and usually credited with being the first American novel, followed this form. The Gothic novel became popular in the wake of a European intellectual movement known as Romanticism, which encouraged writers to reach out into unexplored realms. Charles Brockden Brown took a bold and significant step when he used the Gothic form for novels about American life. Brown's most influential novel was Wieland, published in 1798. Wieland is set in Philadelphia and concerns a man who commits murder while under the influence of a hypnotist. Washington Irving formed the Knickerbockers, a literary group in New York, and published The Sketchbook in 1820. Irving's story of Rip Van Winkle, who falls asleep for 20 years and then returns, has an underlying theme that is found elsewhere in Irving's writings.
How the truth presses home upon us as we advance in life, that everything around us is transient and uncertain.
Sharing Irving's interest in his native land, William Cullen Bryant wrote with refreshing simplicity about his New England.
The calm shade shall bring a kindred calm, and the sweet breeze that makes the green leaves dance shall waft a balm to thy sick heart.
In 1828, Sarah Hale became editor for the Ladies' Magazine. She urged women to conform to social conventions.
The countenance during a dance should be illumined by a smile. It is perfectly absurd for a young lady to show a melancholy aspect among the gaieties of the ballroom.
But she never lost sight of her main purpose, to encourage women to educate themselves.
The social position of women was in some ways comparable to that of slaves. Neither had any political rights. Neither blacks nor women could hold property. neither blacks nor women had any legal standing in the judicial system.
Reflecting on this injustice, many writers became active in the abolitionist movement. David Walker wrote Walker's Appeal, published in 1829, and boldly urged blacks to rise up against slavery, asking,
"Are we men? I ask you, are we men? Did our Creator make us to be slaves?"
George Moses Horton, a black slave, published a book of poems, The Hope of Liberty. One poem concerns his lifelong urge to write.
My genius from a boy has fluttered like a bird within my heart, but could not thus confine her powers employ, impatient to depart.
In the 1830s, Henry Rowe Schoolcraft made a unique contribution to American culture when he began to publish the results of his research into American Indian lore.
One of the things that is important about America from the beginning is that, unlike Europe, there are always at least three races of people who make up the population of America. There are the Native Americans or the Indians. There are the Africans whose enslaved or exploited labor creates much of the wealth for America. And then there are the European immigrants.
Schoolcraft's painstaking research finally brought some of this lost art to the attention of the general public.
The corn comes up. It comes up green. Here upon our fields white tassels unfold. Blue evening falls. Blue evening falls. Nearby in every direction it sets the corn tassels trembling.
In the 1830s, Native Americans and white settlers in great numbers were all pushing westward toward the Golden Gate. James Fenimore Cooper captured this adventurous spirit in his writings.
James Fenimore Cooper is a writer of the American frontier, and his work, the myths that he explored and perhaps we can say invented in his writing continue to have a hold on the American imagination even today.
In his best-known work, The Last of the Mohicans, Cooper has an Indian give his view of white men.
The spirit that made men colored them differently. Some he made with faces paler than the ermine of the forest. He gave this people the nature of the pigeon, wings that never tire, young, more plentiful than the leaves on the trees, and appetites to devour the earth.
Above all, Cooper gave Americans a picture of a part of their vast land that many of them would never have the opportunity to see in person. His words made the frontier of a new nation come alive for his readers. In the fires of the American Revolution, a new American literature was forged, and within it, the embers of justice and freedom glowed deeply.
But for the next 200 years, the American Revolution inspired countries all around the world who were trying to achieve the same rights of man, the same sense of freedom that Franklin spoke about. So that the universality of his saying a philosopher should be able to walk around the whole earth and say, any place, this is my country, is very strong and even prophetic. At least one would like to think so.
Much Native American lore was lost when European settlers took over their land. Their stories were oral, that is, not written. Religious persecution caused thousands of Puritans to immigrate to the New World. Puritans contributed much to early American literature, but their rigid thinking led to their own decline. As ideas about independence were growing, it became increasingly clear to many writers that slavery was wrong. One independent thinker, Benjamin Franklin, was a master of many forms of writing, including satire, humor, and political philosophy. James Fenimore Cooper was a writer of the American frontier. His writing captured the spirit of American adventure.